Hey, the DayZ Devs put out some pretty substantial central economy changes with the recent Road to Badlands update. If you're on social media, then you may be aware these changes have been received with a lot of skepticism and outright head-scratching. I'm here to give some feedback on these changes based on how much I've played lately. Who am I, for context? I'm Dean. I've been playing DayZ since April of 2019, and I have over 6,000 hours between base game, experimental, and some other tests. So I am a fairly experienced player, and I'm also one that enjoys a more hardcore experience in general, just to frame my opinion on these changes. Now, to the actual feedback. I'll be tackling it in segments, but to give a TLDR of sorts, I like the changes in theory. Some of the aspects and specifics definitely need some work. Some guns should be moved around, but I went from maybe doing a bit of DayZ here and there when my friends were playing it, to actively thinking about playing DayZ and being super eager to poke around on it again on a daily basis. First and foremost, I'll talk about the armor changes, as these are much more straightforward than the guns. The armor changes are that plate carriers and stab vests specifically have been made harder to find. Plate carriers will only spawn on the ground on dynamic events, and stab vests will spawn on the ground only in tier 3 and 4. Which sounds rather outrageous, but you can still find the stab vest on zombies in all tiers, and plate carriers on zombies in major military bases, tier 3 and up. NWAF, Vybor, Kamensk, Tizzy. Mishkino tents too, you know the drill. However, when I played, I would quite often find a plate carrier before I even found a stab vest. I think stab vests should be reverted to their pre-patch levels. Over 50% of the weapons in DayZ will one-shot kill or uncon you, so armor is absolutely essential. Granted though, I think the reason plates are easier to find comes down more to how concentrated military loot is. In any given military base that can spawn a plate will have 20, 30, or even more zombies running around due to how big they are, so your chances of pulling a plate there are high, compared to the odd 4 or 5 police zombies that you'll see lurking around your local PD. Furthermore, a point of contention I saw online was that finding a plate carrier before I find a Mosin feels backwards. As I touched upon previously, armor is utterly essential in DayZ, so it makes sense to me that you would want people to be able to find armor, then you introduce the big powerful rifles that can one-shot uncon someone wearing a plate. I'd like people to be finding stab vests in tier 1 and 2, and then presses and plates as they move into tier 3 and 4, and that also lines up with finding a Mosin, a Blaze, a Tundra in tier 3 and 4. If that makes sense, because it does to me. Now, on to the guns. We've already had a statement from the devs in response to the Running Mans on Twitter, that some changes will be made based on feedback. When I saw this comment, I wrongly assumed that some changes had already been hotfixed in, but this is not the case. Any patch has to go the console approvals process, not to mention most of the team are working on Badlands at the moment, so it may be a while yet, unfortunately. I do agree that in no world should an AK-74 and an SKS be locked to helis and convoys, and I have noticed that for some reason AK-101 mags are spawning on police events. The update does place a lot of focus on dynamic events, specifically the Nazdara convoys included in the update, and given that the SCAR was released during this update, I understand why it is currently spawning on convoys, though I do believe that both the SCAR and the DMR should be put in the gas zones, with the LAR being on convoys and helicopters. Though, an important point I want to emphasize about dynamic events is the whole point of a dynamic event is to break you out of the run-of-the-mill loot progression loop that you find yourself in. It's not, in theory, broken if you happen across a dynamic event and find a FAL before you've got a Mosin, because that's dynamic events working as intended. The SKS and AK-74 definitely shouldn't be there though. They should return to military tier 3 spawns. Now, on the civilian side. Two major points of contention are the removal of shotguns from tier 1 and reducing high-powered rifles in towns, and moving them more to barns, castles, and hunting locations. Before the update, my loot progression felt very spiky. I would start off as a freshie, find a shotgun, and then I would use the shotgun until I found an automatic or an SKS. It left a lot of the lower or mid-tier weapons out of the loop. What reason do I have to build up an MP5 or a UMP if I can walk out of Kamishovo with a generally superior weapon. My experience since the patch in this regard has been Tier 1, find a pistol, either in a house or in a PD, and maybe a low tier rifle, a Sporter 22 with a mag for example. Tier 2, I find either an SMG or a shotgun, and this is also where the intermediate caliber rifles start popping up. Your BK-18, your repeater carbine, maybe some of the better ones. Tier 3, you have a lot better chance of finding one of those intermediate rifles, your CR527, your Pioneer, your SSG, but you could also luck out and find a Mosin. But then, Tier 3 is also where I start finding your low to mid tier automatics, your Baby AK, your AUG A1, for example. And then Tier 4 is where you start finding the good shit, the AKM, the VSS, for example. To me, this loop makes sense, broadly speaking, and it also leads me on to talking about high caliber rifles. Out the gate, it is certainly still possible to find a Mosin or a Blaze in a town. I've found a few in my travels since this patch, and I have had much more luck in high tier towns, your Lopatino, Vavilovo, Novaya, Topolniki, but this shift does make castles and specifically hunting spawns much more valuable, similar to my earlier point about plate carriers being easier to find than stab vests due to the concentration of loot. If you loot a castle, you have better chances of finding a rifle, though other players will likely be doing the same. It seems the devs are testing how the community reacts when loot spawns for specific items are more concentrated, as opposed to being more generalized, and I like this idea. Specific loot being more concentrated eliminates some of those pain points of playing RNG-based loot spawning systems, without entirely removing the chance that you'll happen across it naturally. And if this is how the CE is going to be set up in Badlands, I am very, very intrigued. That being said, some more feedback I have that I also want to slot in here is as follows. SMGs should be spawning with magazines much, much more often. All SMGs. You can still fall victim to the situation where you'll find a better gun before you find that 30 round MP5 mag. More SMGs should be spawning in lower tier areas in general. Walking out of tier 1 with a rack, I think would feel pretty nice. Riffy guns should be as follows. The M4A1, the AUG AX, the SCAR, and the DMR. And I think that the SVD and the LAR should be on helis, convoys, and trains. With also the possibility of some run-of-the-mill AKs, but those would also be spawning in Tier 3 for the 101 and the 74, and Tier 4 for the AKM as it spawns currently. That is it from me though. If you have any thoughts on these changes, or thoughts on my thoughts, I suppose, I'd love to hear them. That'll be it for me though, and I hope you'll have a lovely day. See ya!